Greetings to the organizers, participants, and viewers of the special Sunday Tribune webinar presentation on Indenture. My name is Anand Jairaj, and I'm indeed privileged and humbled to be invited to participate. And I do hope that I contribute towards the development of the knowledge towards the history and heritage of Indian indenture. Now, the topic of my presentation is entitled The Legend of Human Cargo, 1860 to 1911, with the subheading Bonded Labor Replacing Slavery. Now, during the height of colonial expansion preceding the 19th century, planters and industrialists in European colonies around the world relied very heavily on slavery for the massive profits that they generated and the immense wealth and they had accumulated and amassed. Now, this scourge of slave trade came to an end within the British Empire when England abolished it with the passing of the Act of Abolition 1833. Now, slaves throughout the British Empire were set free, and that heralded the end of free or cheap labor. Now, subsequent events reveal that the proliferation of migration of Indian indentured laborers to the various colonies was the direct result of abolition of slavery. Now, these laborers were transported from India to the colonies, the European colonies scattered throughout the world in places like the West Indies, Mauritius, Reunion, Seychelles, Fiji, East Africa, and of course the colony of Natal. Now, for the purpose of this narrative, it is important to note that in 1843, Britain officially annexed Natal. In 1856, Natal became a full British Crown colony. Now, at around that time, the colony was caught up in a worldwide recession, and it was on the brink of financial ruin, economic collapse, and bankruptcy. The colonial planters had until that time experimented with various crops such as coffee, tea, cotton, arrowroots, and with little or no economic success. Experimentation in the meantime revealed that sugarcane would thrive here. It became abundantly clear that the sugar industry would prove to be its savior. However, such an enterprise would require labor, and in the case of the colony, cheap labor, low-cost labor. Now, of course, with the abolition of slavery, farmers and industrialists had to resort to some other form of cheap labor. Now, the local Zulus belonged to a proud warrior nation. They were still at odds with the Europeans, whom they regarded as infiltrators in their land and country, and they were reluctant to hire out their labor. On 28th of April 1858, the Natal Mercury, in an ominous editorial that portended disaster, warned that, and I quote, "The fate of the colony hangs on a thread, and that thread is labor." The British colonial planters were in dire financial straits. The planters then resorted to a system referred to as indenture, which reportedly were carried out successfully in other colonies. Under the system, the workers contracted the labor for a fixed period of time for payment of a predetermined wage. Now, in 1859, the local farmers in Natal, in desperation, formally petitioned the government to make arrangements to import indentured laborers from India, which was also under British colonial rule at the time. Now, after initial refusal, India eventually relented and agreed to allow indentured laborers to emigrate to Natal. Following thereupon, laws 13, 14 and 15 of 1859 were passed, and the Natal government did so, and this enabled and facilitated the lawful importation of indentured laborers to be imported to work on the sugar fields in the colony, in this particular colony. Complementary laws had to be passed in India as well to enable them to export these laborers. And once those laws were in place, the SS Truro, as we all know, departed from Madras on the 12th of October 1860 with 342 passengers on board, and it arrived at Durban on the 16th of November, and this was the first ship to bring indentured laborers to Natal from India. In 1866, for various reasons, not least of which was the abject treatment of laborers who were treated no better than slaves, India stopped exporting indentured laborers to Natal. Now, after a hiatus of about 8 years, when improved conditions were ostensibly legislated, importation of labor resumed. Now, of course, the laws improved it, but the actual implementation, history shows, were not implemented. And of course, as the speakers will, or as the presenters will talk about the abject treatment that continued even after the improved legislations from time to time were enacted, right? Now, for our purpose, we must note that the period 1860 to 1911 is thus an important and integral part in the overall history of South Africa, because it was during this turbulent period that over 150,000 indentured laborers were imported from India to the then colony of Natal. Now, the majority of South Africans of Indian descent in South Africa presently can trace their roots to this indentured laborers who came to the colony of Natal. Now, since this presentation is entitled The Legend of Human Cargo, I think it might be appropriate for us to perhaps touch on the voyage from, a typical voyage from India to Natal. Right. Now, during the period of the slave trade, the human cargoes were transported by sailing vessels, and these were, of course, propelled by wind. Now, by the time the indentured laborers began to travel from India to Natal, the ships that plied the oceans were no longer the sailing vessels, but were powered by steam and were referred to as steam ships or steam boats. Now, the steam ships were faster and more reliable than the sailing vessels, but in spite of that, the traveling conditions for the passengers were, of course, nevertheless still relatively arduous and uncomfortable and difficult. Now, the book Documents of Indentured Labor, Natal 1851 to 1917, published by the Institute of Black Research in around 1980, gives some idea of the conditions under which passengers traveled during the early stages of indenture, and by focusing on the first two ships that arrived at Durban. Now, of course, conditions in different ships during different voyages and different times would have been different. However, the following might just give one an idea of what the general situation was like. Right. Now, the book states that the passengers were tightly packed in the paddle steamers in an allotted space of 6 feet by 2. Now, it is reported that when the deck was full, a platform was raised on the side of the vessel. Now, a space amidship was screened off by a sail to serve as a bathroom. Now, of course, bathroom, you can read it as a lavatory or a toilet. And of course, with the cramped condition over there, we can imagine the sanitary conditions of that particular private room would have been. Now, a small room was apparently set aside and served as what you call a hospital. Now, this was kept continuous with cases of itches, ophthalmia, measles, aches, and cold. Now, apparently, it was reported that the deck was littered with listless bodies. Now, owing to the cramped conditions, congested traveling conditions, and lack of proper sanitation, disease spread with ease, and mortality rate was very high. Now, although the Truro itself escaped mortality, now records show that during 1860 to 1866, there were 180 deaths on board ships carrying these human cargoes. Now, in just 1 year, for instance, that was between 1881 to 1882, for instance, there were reportedly 67 deaths on the voyage from India to Natal. There was also the constant fear of assault and sexual harassment, not only from the fellow passengers, but also from the crew members. Now, the following was recorded in the captain's log in a later voyage, sometimes in 1885, and the captain wrote, considering the number of emigrants and the closeness in which they herded together, morality is very small. Now, the captain also recorded that some precautions were taken by separating the single women who were placed in the back of the ship from the married people and single men who were placed at the front. Now, the log also bears an entry which says, but there is nothing, if they have a mind, to prevent single men going to single women and vice versa. Right. Now, in spite of all the measures he reportedly put in place, he said that the warders complained, and I quote, something was going wrong. Now, I leave it to you to imagine what could have gone wrong. Now that we've touched on the actual voyage or traveling conditions from India to Durban, let us now look at what happened upon reaching Durban. Now, when the SS Truro anchored at Durban on Friday, the 16th of November 1860, the arrival was so unexpected that the coolie immigrant agent by the name of Edmund Tatum was not present. He was in Pietermaritzburg. He is said to have galloped through the night from Pietermaritzburg to take up his duties. Now, the passengers therefore only disembarked on Saturday, the next day, on 17th of November 1860. Now, in its 22nd November 1860 edition, the Natal Mercury reported on the arrival of the ship with the opening line as follows. On Friday afternoon last, the 16th instant, the large bark Truro made anchorage and signaled the fact of her having a large number of coolies on board. Now, it goes on to describe the landing as a remarkable scene. Now, the emergence of the human cargo was described inter alia as follows. The swarthy hordes came pouring out of the ship's hold, laughing, jabbering, and staring about them with a very well-satisfied expression of self-complacency on their faces. Now it goes on to report further. They were a queer, comical, foreign-looking, very oriental-like crowd. The men were described as having bare, scraggy shin bones, and the women were described as having flashing eyes, long, disheveled, pitchy hair, with their half-covered, well-formed figures and their keen, inquisitive glances. The children were seen as having meager, intelligent, cute, and humorous countenances. And they were all collectively described as beings of a different race and kind to any we have yet seen either in Africa or England. Now, upon landing, the passengers were herded into what was described as an unfinished barracks surrounded by pools of stagnant waters. And of course, this was done after the obligatory medical examinations. Now, they were expected to find their own place to relieve and wash themselves in the wild, soggy, mosquito-infested, swampy areas of Durban. Now, sores erupted, dysentery, cold, and fever broke out. Although no deaths were reported on voyage, 4 passengers died within a few days of arrival. Now, the immigrants remained under guard in the barracks until the planters came to claim the commodities for which they had signed bonds. By and large, employees wanted good, strong, healthy men who would be able to dig, plow, and perform back-breaking work and turn virgin soil in subtropical area into productive arable land. Now, women and children were regarded as dead stocks. Now, tension and anxiety mounted whilst they were confined in the barracks and awaited assignment. Now, there are reports where some of the immigrants made attempts to flee. Evidently, this became quite a problem for the authorities, so much so that a high wall was built around the barracks to prevent what he called absconding and absence of coolies of the time of distribution, as later reported by a Durban magistrate. Now, the SS Belvedere was the second ship that arrived in Durban, and it brought in passengers from the north of India, and it departed Calcutta and arrived in Durban on the 26th of November 1860. Whilst there were no deaths on board the SS Truro, the Belvedere was described as a catastrophe in practically every respect. Now, within days of departure from Calcutta, cholera broke out on board. It is reported that 25 passengers died on voyage itself. Now, on arrival at Durban, the ship was immediately placed in quarantine. Now, the clothing and beddings were burnt. Now, in addition to cholera, many succumbed to dropsy, dysentery, and insanity. The Natal Mercury reported on the 12th of December 1860 that 23 more people died in the Lazaretto and the stuffy tents in which they awaited their removal to the depots. In all this tragedy and sad human drama, the colonists resented the extra cost that the calamity incurred for them. And they were also lived in fear of infection themselves. Now that we've spoken about the Belvedere, let's see what happened on arrival of the immigrants. Now, when they arrived, of course, the immigrants were medically examined before being confined in barracks and awaited assignments. Assignment means that, being allocated to the respective employees who requisitioned them. One of the stipulations of indenture was that families should be kept together. Right. However, there are reports that, for instance, it states that deviations did occur. Now, there were many instances where families were indeed separated. Now, once assigned, they then began the journey by foot to the places of employment. Now, the journey could be anything from 20 miles or more. They were dispatched to areas like Clare Estate, Cato Estate, Seacow Lake, Springfield, Umgeni, Claremont, and Isipingo, and these were in the county of Durban. Other places were, for instance, Avoca, Ottawa, Verulam, Tongaat, Milkwood Kraal, Shakas Kraal, and Amstrali in the county of Victoria, and also in areas in the county of Alexandra, for instance, Amkomas and Amzinto. Now, the researchers, and bless them, the researchers who were responsible for compiling the documents of indentured labor wrote, and I quote, "For the immigrants, the full import of what they had led themselves into became fully apparent when they reached the places of employment. The first task was to build the huts on earthen floor in demarcated areas, utilizing available material like wattle, grass, and daub. Now they had to endure the inconveniences of wrought by the vagaries of bad weather conditions thereafter. At a later stage, the workers were housed in barracks and what was referred to as coolie lines, and with very questionable sanitary facilities there. The general pattern for the workers was as follows: they had to work from sunrise to sunset, and not by the time set by the clock. Now, when they returned home, what they called home, at dusk after a hard day of back-breaking labor, they had just enough time to have the meals that were prepared from their meager monthly rations allocated to them before they fell into deep sleep through sheer exhaustion. Now they were awakened very early next morning by loud clanging of the bells in the early parts of the next morning, whilst it was still dark, and this was because they had to start work at first light. Now their tasks entailed tilling the soil, planting, fertilizing, weeding, tending the growing crops, harvesting, loading, transporting, milling, packing, leveling roads, as well as building dams, factories and houses, and carrying on repairs and so forth. Now, if a worker was committed any transgression, he was very severely punished. Punishment included heavy fines, cutting back on rations, docking of wages, as well as flogging. Whipping was common in the workplace and would have most certainly left the victims humiliated, defiled, and physiologically and psychologically traumatized. Women were physically, mentally, and sexually abused as well. Children were exploited and made to work, and of course the plight of children may be a field for study as well, because that has not been, to my mind, has been not a very well researched area, and I think there's a fertile field for that particular research to be done as far as the children are concerned. Now the records are replete with incidents of suicide. Of course, many things would have changed or have varied or adapted over the decades, either for the better, but I think more often than not for the worse, to keep pace with the evolving situation. Nevertheless, whatever I've discussed preceding this particular segment should give one an idea of the general conditions that these human cargoes had to endure during the voyages and aftermath thereafter. I have time for that enough, and thank you very much for bearing along with me, and I thank the organizers for affording me the opportunities to address you. Thank you very much, and good luck to all of you.